All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're going to break down a book that really has been one of the most influential reads on Christian missions for the last few decades. I'm talking about John Piper's Let the Nations Be Glad. Now, you got to understand, this book is so much more than just a how-to guide for missions. It's a really deep dive into the why, the theology behind it all. And it throws out some ideas that are, well, they're powerful and, for some people, pretty controversial. So we're going to unpack the big arguments that have really challenged and honestly inspired so many people. And right from the get-go, Piper just drops this bombshell of a statement. I mean, really think about this for a second. He's saying that missions, the whole thing, isn't the ultimate goal. It's temporary. It exists because something else doesn't exist everywhere yet. And that something is worship. This one idea completely flips conventional thinking on its head. Okay, so here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we're going to dig into that main idea, worship. Then we'll look at the world Piper's writing into. The big shifts happening in Christianity today. After that, we'll get into his whole life is war metaphor, tackle some of the tougher questions, and wrap it all up with the main point of everything, God's glory. All right, first step, worship. According to Piper, you just can't get a handle on missions until you see that worship is, well, it's both the starting gun and the finish line tape. And this really breaks it down for us. See, worship is the fuel for missions. Why? Because as Piper says, you can't commend what you don't cherish. You just can't. That genuine, passionate love for God is what drives everything. But it's also the goal. The whole point is to invite every nation on earth into what he calls that white-hot enjoyment of God's glory. It's this incredible cycle, right? Worship fuels the mission, and the mission creates more worshipers. So, okay, how does this theology actually connect with the world we live in today? I mean, Piper isn't just writing this stuff in an ivory tower. He's looking at two massive, and I mean massive, shifts happening in Christianity right now. The first one is what historian Lemon Sane called a breathtaking development. You see, for hundreds of years, Christianity was pretty much seen as a Western thing. But that's just not the case anymore. The center of gravity has shifted. The real explosive growth is now in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, what we call the Global South. The entire map of Christianity has been completely redrawn. And the scale of this change, it's just staggering. Just listen to some of these stats from historian Mark Knoll. You've got more Anglicans going to church in just a few African countries than in Britain, Canada, and the US combined. More Presbyterians in church in Ghana than in the whole of Scotland, where the denomination has deep roots. We're even seeing more Christian missionaries coming from Brazil than from places like Britain or Canada. I mean, it is a truly seismic shift. But this incredible growth also brings a new kind of challenge, a big theological battle. Piper points directly at the rise of what's called the prosperity gospel, this idea that God shows his favor mainly through health and wealth. And, he points out the pretty sad irony that some of the worst versions of this idea are actually being exported from America and Europe to the global south. So in response, Piper lays out what he calls 12 appeals to prosperity preachers. He says, look, this teaching can actually put up roadblocks to heaven. He warns that the desire to get rich can be spiritually deadly, and he really hammers this point home. Suffering isn't some kind of bug in the system. It's a feature, a necessary part of the Christian life. And it all comes down to this: God himself, not his gifts, not the stuff. He has to be the greatest treasure. Okay, so this all leads to a really practical question. How is this mission supposed to get done? If worship is the goal and we're in this new, shifting world, what does that look like on the ground? Well, for Piper, the whole thing is framed by this one powerful and pretty stark metaphor. Life is war. And that idea is absolutely central to how he sees prayer. He says, look, we often just don't get what prayer's for. And the reason is we've completely forgotten that we're in the middle of a spiritual war. And here's the famous analogy he uses to explain it. He says prayer is not like a domestic intercom you use to ask for more pillows in the living room. No. It's a wartime walkie-talkie. It's your direct line to headquarters for air support, for reinforcements, for battle strategy. It's a tool for the war, not a tool for your personal comfort. And in this war, suffering isn't some random, terrible accident. Piper argues it's a strategic, God-ordained part of the plan. It's the normal, expected cost of a godly life. And God actually uses it as a tool, a way to advance the mission. Sometimes persecution and hardship are what God uses to reposition his troops to a whole new front line. So, with all this talk of war and suffering and a global mission, you have to ask the big question. What is actually at stake here? Why all the urgency? And this is where we get into some of the most uncomfortable, most challenging claims in the entire book. And it all boils down to this one question. Is consciously believing in Jesus Christ actually necessary to be saved? I mean, think about it. If people can be saved without ever hearing the name of Jesus, then does all the sacrifice and cost of missions really make sense? Piper's answer is a clear, unambiguous yes. He argues that when Jesus came, everything changed. Before that, there were what the Bible calls times of ignorance. But ever since Jesus arrived, God's plan is to glorify his Son by making him the one and only conscious focus of saving faith for everyone. And the stakes of that yes are tied directly to what happens to those who don't have that faith. Now, Piper holds to the traditional view of hell, which is eternal conscious punishment. It's really important to say that's not the only view out there. Other highly respected theologians like John Stott, for example, believed in what's called annihilation, that the unrepentant simply cease to exist. But for Piper, his view is crucial because, in his mind, the severity of hell is what shows the infinite value of the glory of God that was rejected. And you see, that brings us right back around, full circle, to the ultimate point that drives everything else we've talked about, which is the supreme glory of God. This next line is maybe the most famous thing Piper has ever written, and it builds on the work of the great American theologian Jonathan Edwards. It's the core of what he calls Christian hedonism. And the idea is this: God's glory and your deepest, most lasting happiness are not two separate things you have to choose between. In fact, they're one and the same. God is most glorified in you when you are most satisfied in him. And that is why the book is called what it is. Let the nations be glad. The ultimate goal of all of history isn't just for people to obey God out of duty, but to be glad in God. The whole point of missions is to spread that joy to every single people group on the planet. So we're left with this final massive question. If our highest purpose as human beings is to find our joy in God, and if God's highest purpose is to be glorified by being the source of that joy, what does that mean for missions? What does that mean for everything else? For Piper, the answer is simple. It changes absolutely everything.